Pedagogy Indicators by Lucian Green Aigs for Pedagogy Helper 3 and 3. 35. I wrote rather than listened. I stated that the creation and performance of the help pedagogy aig is stronger than seeing and copying it. The creator-performer examined the aig. The creator-performer wrote in the aig. The creator-performer learned about the aig. 36. The self described what the other thought. The self reasoned out the 15 reasonings in the aig. The self wrote about the aig. The self wrote inside out. The self described the other. 37. The self examined the logos. The self endorsed the subject being mentioned in the reasonings chapter of the aig, helped by a pedagogy helper. The self knew the other. The self knew about the second other. The self knew about the other two. 38. I discovered how Aigs worked. The pedagogy helper stated that the aig was an element of the Aigs, and that the Aigs were available when wanted. The self noted that there was an aig. The self wanted the aig. The self took the aig. 39. The self observed that God did exist. Delta time equals 0 in aig pedagogy help, showing that God, man, replicates aigs instantly, and so God, man, exists. The self noticed the ruler. The self noticed God, the man. The self noticed the other. 40. The self observed more others. The self observed that the pedagogy helper created pedagogues. The self solved the social complexes. The self remedied the economic conundrums. The self avoided the medical questions. 41. The self observed that aigs were important. The pedagogy helper helping with pedagogical aigs was necessary. The self noticed the other. The self noticed realism. The self noticed the other thinking about aigs. 42. The self observed that pedagogy is necessary. Pedagogy shaped with aigs by the pedagogy helper is necessary. The pedagogy helper found out the 10 aigs. The reasoner shaped the reasoning from the pedagogy helper with them. The self saw what the other meant. 43. The self observed that aigs help with pedagogy. The self was right to know how the other knew what the other knew. The other knew what the other knew. The self was right to know this. So, the self was right to know how the other knew pedagogy. 44. The self knew that it was good. The self knew what you knew again. The self knew what you knew. The self knew what you knew in detail. The self knew it. 45. The self knew about the other also. The self knew what the other knew and that it was right. The self knew it. The other knew it too. The self knew it was good too. 46. I examined why it was. The self knew how and now. The self knew how the others knew what they knew. I knew they knew now. I knew how it was. 47. The self wanted the other. The self knew where the other went and what the other did with it. The self wanted the other. The other wanted the self. The self and other did it. 48. The self observed the other with the self. The host successfully bore the minor with help from pedagogy aigs. The host bore the minor. The host protected the minor. The host helped the minor. 49. The self saw what the self meant by self. The self saw the other with help from pedagogy aigs. The self saw the other. The other saw the self. The self examined the self. 50. The self saw the other. The self knew why God knew the reason. The self knew the self. The other knew the self. The self saw why God knew the reason.